My name is Vivian, and I was 8 years old. The rainy Tuesday afternoon, my father sat at the oak dining table with a sharp blue ballpoint pen and a gray plastic calculator, totaling the exact cost of my existence down to the very last cent. The rain was drumming a steady hollow rhythm against the single-pane windows of the old craftsman house, a sound that seemed to underscore the absolute silence inside the room. My father, Arthur, did not look up when I stepped into the dining room, my damp canvas sneakers leaving faint fading tracks on the worn hardwood floor. He was focused entirely on a long column of figures written in his tight legalistic handwriting across the pages of a gray ledger book. Beside the ledger sat three distinct piles of paper, each sorted by date and pinned down with small, smooth stones he had collected from the driveway to keep them from fluttering in the draft. I stood near the edge of the frayed wool rug, holding my breath, watching the steady click-click of his thumb against the plastic buttons of the machine. He was a man who measured the world strictly in terms of carrying costs and depreciating assets. To Arthur, an itemized receipt was the only true reflection of a person's worth, and every relationship was a ledger that either balanced or ran into the red. My mother had vanished from the record 6 years earlier, leaving behind nothing but a stack of medical debts and a collection of old tools that had belonged to her own father, a master mason who had helped build the very foundation we stood upon. Arthur had systematically liquidated every piece of her jewelry, her books, and her clothing within 48 hours of her departure, converting her memory into a small, neat deposit slip that he filed away in his steel cabinet. The only object he had overlooked was a heavy, tarnished iron plumb bob that had slipped behind the drawers of the workbench in the basement. It was a simple tool, a pointed cylinder of solid iron suspended by a thick, knotted cotton cord, used to find an absolute vertical line. I had found it when I was 7, tucked it into the pocket of my pinafore, and kept it hidden beneath the loose floorboard in my closet as the sole remnant of a lineage that did not involve compound interest. On that afternoon, Arthur completed his calculations with a sharp, definitive stroke of his blue pen, drawing a double underline beneath the final figure at the bottom of the page. The number was $4,762.18, a sum that represented every gallon of milk, every pair of orthopedic shoes, and every school textbook he had purchased for me since the month my mother left. He capped the pen with a distinct plastic snap that sounded like a dry twig breaking in the winter woods. When he finally raised his eyes to look at my face, there was no anger in his expression, which made the moment far more chilling than any physical outburst could have been. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, completely devoid of warmth or malice, reflecting only the cold satisfaction of a clerk who had successfully balanced an unruly account. "You are a financial dead weight, Vivian." He spoke the words with a calm, flat cadence, his voice carrying the weight of an undeniable mathematical truth. He tapped the open ledger with his index finger, ensuring his fingernail made a sharp clicking sound against the paper. He went on to explain that every hour he spent maintaining the roof over my head was an hour stolen from his independent consulting work, and that my presence in the house was an ongoing deficit he had chosen to tolerate only out of a strict sense of civic obligation. He did not ask me to speak, nor did he offer any comfort when he noticed the quiet trembling of my chin. He merely closed the ledger, placed the stone back on top of it, and instructed me to change out of my damp shoes before the moisture permanently worked the oak floorboards. I did not cry because I already understood that tears were an inefficient expenditure of energy that would only increase my perceived liability in his eyes. Welcome back to the Calm Revenge episodes, a space dedicated to exploring the quiet endings for people who were never the loudest one in the room. If you find value in narratives where patience outlasts arrogance and justice is delivered with clinical precision, please consider leaving a comment with your thoughts and subscribing to the channel to support our work. I walked up the narrow stairs to my bedroom, my movements deliberate and silent, practicing the art of taking up as little physical and financial space as possible. I pulled up the loose floorboard near the radiator, reached into the dark, dust-scented gap, and wrapped my small fingers around the cold, heavy iron plumb bob. The weight of the iron was grounding, a physical reminder that there were laws of gravity and balance that existed completely outside of Arthur's ledger books. I held it against my palm until the metal warmed to the temperature at my skin, promising myself that I would learn to navigate his world using the same cold, analytical precision he used against me. as the years passed, Arthur's system of accounting grew more rigorous and deeply entrenched. By the time I turned 14, the gray ledger had been replaced by a series of password-protected spreadsheets on a desktop computer that hummed constantly in his locked study. He began charging me a prorated share of the utility bills, deducting the amounts from the meager allowance I earned by maintaining the garden and scrubbing the grout in the bathrooms. Every gallon of hot water I used for a shower was timed with a plastic egg timer he suction cupped to the shower wall. 15 minutes was the maximum allocation, and every minute thereafter incurred a 50-cent penalty that was added to my running balance. I did not protest because I watched how he treated neighbors, contractors, and local businesses who dared to argue with his terms. He would simply retreat to his study, unearth a forgotten clause in a contract or a minute discrepancy in a local zoning ordinance, and use it to grind them down until they settled for pennies on the dollar. He was a master of the small legalistic chokehold, and he took immense pride in his ability to outweight and outdocument anyone who crossed his path. He often told the few associates who visited the house that people failed because they allowed emotion to cloud their long-term strategies, whereas he viewed every human interaction as a simple foreclosure waiting to happen. I observed his methods from the periphery, studying the way he organized his files, the way he drafted demand letters, and the way he used public records to find the hidden vulnerabilities of his opponents. It was an exhausting way to grow up, but it provided me with an unintentional education that no university could ever replicate. When I reached my 18th birthday, Arthur did not offer a cake or a word of congratulations. Instead, he presented me with a formal notarized residential lease agreement for the small bedroom I had occupied since infancy. The lease required a monthly payment of $450, due on the first of each month, with a strict 5% late fee applied at precisely 12:01 a.m. on the second day. He stood in the doorway of my room, holding a clipboard and a fresh blue pen, his gray eyes fixed on my face as I read through the 7 pages of dense, single-spaced text. He reminded me that I was now a legal adult and that if I chose not to sign, my belongings would be placed on the curb by noon the following day, as he had already prepared the necessary abandonment notices. I signed the lease without a single word of complaint, using a steady hand that did not betray the burning resolve hardening inside my chest. I knew that leaving without a proper foundation would only force me into unstable financial situations where he could predict my failure, and I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing his predictions come true. I took a job as a clerk in the county recorder's office, a low-paying, tedious position that Arthur openly mocked during our silent dinners in the kitchen. He called it dead-end administrative drudgery, completely blind to the fact that the county recorder's office was the central repository for every deed, every lien, every mortgage, and every property dispute in the entire jurisdiction. While Arthur spent his evenings analyzing his stocks and drafting complaints against the local utility companies, I spent my days mastering the intricate, archaic world of property titles, chain of custody documentation, and historical land grants. I learned how to track a piece of dirt from the moment it was carved out of the wilderness in the 19th century down to its current tax assessment block. I discovered that land, much like human memory, holds secrets that cannot be easily erased by a modern filing or a quick click claim deed. I became a certified land title extractor, a quiet professional who sits in the basement archives of the county building, tracing the long hidden lineages of wealth and ownership that govern the city. It was a job that required absolute silence, infinite patience, and an eye for the microscopic errors that other people make when they are in too much of a hurry to claim what they think is theirs. Arthur continued to live in the Craftsman House on Elm Street, treating the property as his personal fortress and the ultimate proof of his financial superiority. He had acquired the house through a complex series of probate maneuvers following my grandfather's death in 1998, maneuvers that had effectively cut out my mother's siblings and left Arthur as the sole owner of record. He took great pleasure in reminding me every time I handed him my monthly rent check that I was merely a guest in a house that his superior intellect had secured for his exclusive estate. He never suspected that every evening after I locked my bedroom door, I would pull out the iron plumb bob, set it on my desk, and use the precision I learned at work to review the public history of the ground beneath our feet, waiting for the one structural flaw he had missed. The arrangement remained undisturbed for 11 years, a period during which I paid Arthur exactly $59,400 in rent, never missing a single deadline by so much as a minute. Every month, I handed him a physical cashier's check drawn from my account at the county credit union, and every month he accepted it with a silent nod, immediately logging the transaction into his digital system before endorsing the back with a rubber stamp. I turned 29 in the autumn, and the rhythm of the house on Elm Street had become as predictable as the ticking of a grandfather clock, governed by the silent friction of two people sharing a space without ever truly sharing a life. I spend my days in the climate-controlled vaults of the county records building, examining century-old survey maps and property deeds, while Arthur remained entombed in his study, managing his investments and consulting for local real estate syndicates. He had grown increasingly detached, his conversations limited to brief clinical assessments of property tax increases or the rising cost of residential heating oil. The transition occurred on the 16th of October, exactly 14 days before my 30th birthday, under a sky the color of wet slate. When I returned from work at 5:30 in the evening, the house was uncharacteristically cold. The thermostat turned down to 52 degrees, a temperature Arthur usually reserved for long periods of absence. I found him in his study, the doors swung wide open for the first time in years, the room illuminated only by the harsh blue glare of his dual computer monitors. He was sitting perfectly straight in his leather ergonomic chair, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with a rhythmic clacking sound that echoed down the hallway. On the left screen, a real estate appraisal tool displayed a series of colorful heat maps of our neighborhood. On the right screen, a dense Microsoft Excel spreadsheet was filled with numbers, columns of calculations, and a flashing red total at the bottom. I stood near the door frame, my heavy wool coat still buttoned to the chin, my leather briefcase held firmly in my right hand, watching him silently as he manipulated the data. He did not look up to acknowledge my presence, but his shoulder muscles tightened slightly, a physical cue I had learned to recognize over 2 decades of observation. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of his mouse as he calculated the precise financial value of every square foot of the property, factoring in current market trends, neighborhood appreciation rates, and the potential yield of a complete structural redevelopment. He was assessing the house not as a home, but as an obstacle to a higher margin of profit, and he was doing so with the detached intensity of a surgeon performing a necessary amputation. When he finally ceased his typing, the silence that settled over the study was heavy and absolute, broken only by the low hum of the computer cooling fans. He turned his chair slowly to face me, his hands resting flat on the armrests, his features completely cast in the cold blue light of the displays. He informed me, without a single introductory remark or a trace of hesitation, that he had finalized an agreement to sell the entire property to a commercial development firm known as Vanguard Residential Partners for the sum of $485,000. The developers had no intention of preserving the Craftsman House. They planned to demolish it within 60 days to break ground on a 12-unit luxury condominium complex. Arthur pulled a printed document from the tray of his laser printer, the paper still warm from the rollers, and held it out toward me across the mahogany desk. It was a formal 30-day notice to quit tenancy, drafted with the precise legal terminology he had spent a lifetime perfecting, demanding that I vacate the premises no later than midnight on the 15th of November. He explained that Vanguard Residential Partners had offered a 15% premium for an expedited, unencumbered closing, and that my ongoing presence in the house was a luxury he could no longer afford to subsidize. He noted that the $59,000 I had paid in rent over the past 11 years had failed to keep pace with the true opportunity cost of the real estate, leaving him with an unacceptable deficit in his long-term portfolio. "You are a financial deadweight, Vivian." He repeated the phrase with the exact same flat, mathematical cadence he had used when I was 8 years old, his voice carrying no more emotion than a bank teller reading a balance statement. He stated that he had reviewed his historical logs and determined that my childhood upbringing, combined with the below-market rent I had enjoyed during my 20s, had cost him a total of $74,220 in lost investment compounding. The eviction was not a personal matter, he assured me, but a standard portfolio rebalancing that any rational actor would execute when faced with a stagnant asset. I did not scream, I did not drop my briefcase, and I did not ask him where he expected me to go with less than a month's notice in a hyper-competitive rental market. I stood perfectly still on the worn carpet, my left hand buried deep inside my coat pocket, My fingers tightly closed around the cold, heavy iron plumb bob that had belonged to my grandfather. The pointed metal tip pressed firmly into the meat of my palm, a sharp, grounding pain that kept my breathing regular and my eyes completely dry. I looked past Arthur's shoulder at the computer screen, memorizing the name of the purchasing entity and the specific parcel identification number listed on the digital contract block for 2012, Lot 8. I took the warm piece of paper from his hand, folded it neatly into quarters, and slid it into my briefcase without offering a single word of resistance or a plea for extension. Arthur appeared slightly discomfited by my absolute lack of an emotional reaction, his brow furrowing for a brief moment before he reclaimed his composure. He told me that he had already arranged for a moving crew to pack his personal belongings and his financial archives on the 1st of the month, and that any items left behind by me after the 15th would be treated as abandoned property and discarded at my expense. He then turned his back to me, returning his gaze to the computer monitors to initiate the transfer of his earnest money deposit into a high-yield brokerage account. I walked back down the dark hallway to my bedroom, closing the door behind me with a gentle, silent click that did not disturb the quiet house. The true extent of Arthur's calculation revealed itself 24 hours later, when he launched a preemptive public campaign designed to insulate his reputation from any local criticism or familial judgment. He was fully aware that our community valued the historical integrity of Elm Street, and he knew that evicting his own daughter to facilitate the demolition of a neighborhood landmark would be viewed with severe distaste by the remaining members of my mother's family. To control the narrative, he used his access to the neighborhood association's digital portal and his extensive email distribution list to publish a formal statement to our neighbors, colleagues, and relatives. Notice is hereby given that the estate located at 42012 Elm Street will transition to new ownership effective next month, Arthur wrote in the broadcast message, a copy of which arrived in my inbox at precisely noon the following day. To ensure full transparency and correct any potential mischaracterizations, please be informed that this decision was necessitated by a protracted period of financial non-viability regarding the current residential arrangements. For over a decade, I have provided subsidized housing to my adult daughter Vivian Vance at a significant personal loss that has compromised my retirement security and exhausted the equitable cost-sharing standards required for a sustainable household. Despite multiple opportunities to establish independent financial solvency, her continued reliance on my estate has created an unsustainable burden, leaving me with no alternative but to liquidate the asset to satisfy outstanding liabilities and secure my independent future. The public message was a masterpiece of cold character assassination, presented under the guise of an aggrieved, logical parent who had reached the limit of his generosity. Within hours of its transmission, my phone began to buzz with silent notifications from distant aunts and former neighbors, some offering superficial condolences, others subtly validating Arthur's right to protect his financial interests against a permanent dependent. They looked at the numbers he provided, they read the clinical language of his announcement, and they accepted his version of reality because they had always been intimidated by his meticulous documentation. They did not see the 11 years of cashier's checks, the timed showers, or the core logs that had paid for every square inch of my existence. I sat at my small desk in the corner of my bedroom reading the public notice over and over again until the words lost their capacity to sting and became nothing more than raw data. I did not reply to the email, nor did I post a defense on the neighborhood forum to contest his claims. I reached beneath the loose floorboard, pulled out the iron plumb bob, and let it hang from its knotted cotton cord over the edge of the desk, watching it sway slightly before settling into a perfect, unwavering vertical line. The house around me felt fragile, a shell of wood and plaster that Arthur believed he owned completely, but I knew something about the land beneath the foundation that he had completely failed to investigate in his haste to secure his $485,000 payout. I opened my professional research journal, turned to a fresh, unlined page and began to draft a list of specific public documents that required my immediate extraction from the county archives the following morning. The baseline archives of the county building were located 3 floors below the street level, a subterranean world of hum and fluorescent light where the air was thick with the scent of decomposing paper and chemical toner. On the morning of October 17th, exactly 16 hours after Arthur handed me my eviction notice, I sat at an isolated microfilm reader in the back corner of the vault, my fingers adjusting the plastic dials with mechanical familiarity. The glowing green screen reflected off my glasses as I scrolled through the digitized property records of the late 20th century, looking for the specific file marked transaction number 94-872. This was the exact probate file from July of 1998, the legal mechanism Arthur had utilized to claim sole ownership of the Elm Street house after my maternal grandfather passed away. For over 3 hours, I traced the digital lineage of Block 420 Lot 8, comparing the signatures, the notary stamps, and the date markers with the clinical detachment of a forensic accountant. My professional training had taught me that the grander a man's financial arrogance, the more likely he is to leave a critical vulnerability in the foundation of his documentation. Arthur was a man who relied on the intimidation of long, dense legal paragraphs to keep people from looking at the core numbers, believing that no one would have the stamina to double-check his work. As I pulled up the original deed from 1961 when my grandfather first purchased the land, my fingers stopped moving on the control wheel. I found the flaw not in what Arthur had added to the record in 1998, but in what he had omitted. My grandfather, a master mason who understood structural integrity both in stone and in contracts, had inserted a specific restrictive reversionary covenant into the original deed transfer. The clause stated that the property could only be transferred to a direct blood descendant for residential use, and that any attempt to sell the parcel to a non-familial commercial entity would automatically trigger a reversion of the title. According to the exact language of the 1961 covenant, if a commercial sale were attempted, 50% of the property's legal title would immediately vest in my mother's surviving heirs, while the remaining 50% would freeze until a probate court could determine the rightful lineage. Arthur's $495,000 contract with Vanguard Residential Partners was a legal impossibility. He had signed an unencumbered sale agreement for an asset he did not fully own, representing himself as the sole title holder when, in reality, he was merely a tenant in common with a dormant estate. He had completely overlooked this clause during his 1998 probate maneuvers because the covenant had been recorded on a supplementary rider that was misindexed during the county's transition to digital storage in 2004. He had never found it because he had never looked at the physical paper. He had relied on a superficial digital title summary that failed to reference the underlying historical restrictions. I printed 3 copies of the original 1961 deed, the 1998 probate petition, and the specific misindexed rider, watching the black ink dry on the crisp white paper with a calm, steady focus. The weapon was entirely invisible to Arthur, locked away in his digital spreadsheets, while the physical proof sat neatly inside my leather briefcase. The weight of Arthur's public campaign began to take its physical toll 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening when the autumn wind was rattling the loose storm windows of my bedroom. I sat at my desk looking at my phone, which had become a source of quiet, steady hostility. An email from my Aunt Beatrice arrived at 7:40 p.m., containing 4 paragraphs of cold reprimand, advising me to stop draining my father's retirement funds and to find a modest apartment that matched my limited professional standing. The local neighborhood association forum had pinned Arthur's announcement to the top of the community board, where several acquaintances had commented on the unfortunate reality of adult children refusing to leave the nest. The isolation was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the walls of my room feel as though they were closing in on my chest. I pulled a blank sheet of white paper toward me, picked up a black gel pen, and began to draft a letter of complete surrender. My hand was shaking slightly as I wrote the first few words, stating that I would waive the remainder of my 30-day notice, vacate the property by the end of the week, and make no further claims on the household or my father's estate. The exhaustion had settled deep into my marrow, a profound weariness born from 22 years of being measured against a calculator and found wanting. I felt the dangerous temptation to simply give up, to disappear into a cheap rental on the edge of the city, and to let Arthur have his flawless victory and his $485,000. I reached the 3rd sentence of the draft, my pen hovering over the paper as I prepared to sign my name, admitting that I had been the liability he always claimed I was. As I leaned forward, my elbow brushed against the edge of the desk, causing the loose floorboard near my feet to creak slightly in the quiet room. The sound broke my focus, pulling my eyes down to the small, dark gap in the wood where I'd kept my grandfather's iron plumb bob hidden for more than 2 decades. I reached down, pulled the heavy metal object from its hiding place, and let the cold iron rest against the center of my palm. The weight was an anchor, an unyielding physical reality that refused to bend to the lies Arthur had broadcasted to the world. My grandfather had cast this iron with his own hands, using it to build walls that stood perfectly straight through 40 years of winter storms, relying on the simple, immutable law of gravity. People could alter digital spreadsheets, write cruel emails, and manipulate public opinion, but they could not alter the physical truth of an absolute vertical line. I looked back at the surrender letter, picked up the paper, and tore it into 4 neat pieces, dropping them into the wastebasket before placing the iron plumb bob directly on top of my research notes. If you have ever had your truth twisted by someone who weaponized your silence against you, you are not alone in this room. Leave a one-word comment below steady to let me know you are listening, and to remind yourself that a well-built foundation can never be undone by a loud voice. The following afternoon, I took my research files to a small wood-paneled office located above a hardware store on 10th Street, where Thomas sat behind a desk piled high with leather-bound legal reporters. Thomas was 72 years old, a retired chief title examiner for the state title insurance pool, a man whose skin had the texture of old parchment, and whose eyes had spent 50 years looking for the small, fatal errors that hidden greed always leaves behind. He did not speak as I laid out the photocopies of the 1961 deed, the 1998 probate filings, and the certified title history of Block 422, Lot 8. He pulled a heavy brass magnifying glass from his drawer and began to read through the dense text, his index finger tracing the lines of Arthur's tight signature with deliberate care. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the small office was the ticking of a battery-operated wall clock and the occasional rustle of the paper as Thomas compared the documents. He did not offer any emotional commentary, nor did he express surprise at the depths of the discrepancy I had uncovered. When he completed his review, he carefully stacked the papers into a neat pile, aligned the edges against his desk, and looked up at me over the rims of his reading glasses, his expression completely neutral. Your father has constructed an incredibly dangerous financial position for himself, Thomas said, his voice a low, dry rasp that carried the weight of 50 years of statutory clarity. He tapped the 1961 rider with the tip of his pencil. This reversionary covenant is fully active and completely unextinguished by the 1998 probate action, because your mother's estate was never formally liquidated under the missing person statutes. By signing a contract with Vanguard Residential Partners that guarantees a clean, unencumbered fee-simple title, Arthur has legally bound himself to deliver something he does not possess. He has already accepted a $75,000 earnest money deposit from them, which he has deposited into a restricted trading account. If this title defect is formally entered into the public record before the closing date, the title insurance company will immediately withdraw their commitment, the contract will default, and Vanguard will be legally entitled to treble damages for breach of warranty under State Property Code Section 84. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the old leather creaking under his weight, his eyes remaining fixed on my face. He explained the exact metrics of the trap Arthur had walked into, noting that the developers had already spent $32,000 on architectural surveys and environmental assessments based on Arthur's written guarantee of sole ownership. If the sale collapsed due to an undisclosed title defect that Arthur had actively hidden from the record during the 1998 probate filing, he would not merely lose the $485,000 from the sale. He would be personally liable for the full development costs incurred, his investment accounts would be frozen by an immediate injunction, and the county prosecutor would be required to review the 1998 filings for potential probate fraud. Thomas looked at me, his hand resting on the telephone, waiting to see if I wanted him to draft a formal warning letter to give Arthur an opportunity to negotiate a settlement. Let it run. I spoke the 3 words with a quiet, precise emphasis, my voice steady and completely devoid of anger. Thomas nodded once, a slow professional acknowledgement of my choice, and pulled a fresh piece of legal cap toward him to begin drafting the formal title discrepancy injunction that would be filed with the county clerk. There would be no early warnings, no emotional confrontations over the kitchen table, and no opportunities for Arthur to manipulate the documentation to cover his tracks. The system he had used to extract $59,000 from his daughter would now be allowed to operate with its own cold mechanical inevitability, tracing the line of his own errors down to the absolute penny. The final week of October brought an unseasonable frost that withered the remaining marigolds in the front garden, leaving the earth around the craftsman house black and brittle. Inside, Arthur was operating with an accelerated efficiency, his arrogance manifesting in a flurry of administrative actions that he displayed openly on the dining room table as if to remind me of my impending displacement. He had received the finalized closing addendums from Vanguard Residential Partners, and rather than keeping them in his locked study, he left them spread across the oak wood, weighted down by his collection of driveway stones. He had negotiated a new clause that advanced the closing date from the 15th of November to the 10th, a maneuver that earned him an additional $12,500 as an expedited performance bonus. He spent his evenings reviewing inventory sheets from the 3 separate moving companies he had interviewed, cross-referencing their fuel surcharges and insurance liability limits down to the 4th decimal point. I watched him from the kitchen doorway as he signed the expedited contract amendment with his blue ballpoint pen, his movements sharp and self-assured. He looked up, his pale gray eyes catching the dim overhead light, and informed me that he had already filed the pre-emptive utility disconnection notices for the 11th of November at precisely 8:30 a.m. He noted that if my personal belongings were still within the walls when the power grid was severed, any damage caused by the subsequent drop in interior temperature would be my sole financial responsibility. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who believed every variable in his universe had been permanently conquered by his spreadsheet. He had no concept of the reality that was quietly gathering in the public record 3 floors beneath the city streets, a reality that was being systematically assembled by a retired title examiner and a silent land abstractor. On the morning of October 28th, I met Thomas in his small office on 10th Street to review the certified copies of the injunction paperwork he had prepared for the county court. The room smelled of wet wool and old adhesive, the radiator clanking a steady, uneven rhythm against the baseboard as Thomas laid out the final civil filings. He pointed to the updated title abstract I had extracted, which now included the newly executed Vanguard contract addendum that Arthur had proudly left on the dining table, a document I had photocopied while he was asleep. Arthur had signed an explicit affidavit of sole title and warranty, a legal instrument in which he swore under penalty of perjury that no prior encumbrances, covenanters, or reversionary rights existed on Block 412, Lot 8. By chasing the $12,500 acceleration bonus, he had legally elevated his omission from a standard probate oversight to an active fraudulent misrepresentation in an executed commercial transaction. Thomas leaned back against his leather chair, his old fingers interlaced over his woolen vest, his gaze fixed on the black ink of the court summons. He shook his head slowly, a faint, clinical smile touching the corners of his mouth, though his eyes remained entirely serious. He noted that Arthur had been so consumed by the mathematics of his profit margin that he had failed to perform the foundational task of any competent real estate investor, which was to read the underlying root deed in its physical entirety rather than relying on a computerized index summary. By signing the warranty affidavit to secure the faster payout, he had locked the mechanism of his own financial destruction into place, leaving himself 0 avenues for legal retreat or standard insurance indemnification. He wrote his own verdict. He just never read it back. Thomas spoke the words with a dry, rhythmic precision, his voice echoing slightly in the cramped office. He explained that by entering this fraudulent affidavit into the transaction, Arthur had stripped himself of the standard protections offered by his errors and omissions insurance policy, meaning every dollar of damages Vanguard pursued would have to be extracted directly from his personal liquid accounts and his brokerage portfolio. The legal machinery was now fully primed, the court date set for the morning of November 10th, the exact hour Arthur had appointed for the closing of his grand transaction. If you are listening to this narrative and recognize the profound power of a quiet, unyielding strategy over a loud display of temporary arrogance, please take a moment to ensure you are subscribed to the Calm Revenge episodes, where we examine the steady reckonings of those who refuse to be silenced. On the evening of November 2nd, exactly 8 days before the scheduled closing, I provided Arthur with his one final opportunity to back down from the edge of the clearing. He was sitting at the dining table, surrounded by 45 heavy-duty cardboard boxes he had purchased at a wholesale discount, using a black marker to label each one with a specific room designation and an inventory number. The house was entirely silent save for the squeak of his marker against the cardboard. I stepped into the room, my hands buried deep inside my cardigan pockets, my fingers resting on the smooth, heavy iron plumb bob that remained my constant companion. I stood at the opposite end of the table, looking down at the long column of numbers he was verifying for his moving insurance. Arthur, I said, keeping my voice low, balanced, and entirely devoid of any emotional inflection. Before you finalize the deed transfer and authorize the demolition crews to dismantle this house on the 10th, I want to ask you to review the original 1961 acquisition records one more time. There are historical terms tied to my grandfather's estate that cannot be cleared by a standard digital title summary, and proceeding with an unencumbered warranty deed under these conditions will introduce an immediate structural failure to your transaction. I am asking you to pause the sale, rescind the eviction notice, and allow us to audit the probate history together before the legal window closes. Arthur stopped his marker mid-stroke, the black felt tip leaving a dark bleeding spot on the brown cardboard box. He raised his head slowly, his features contorted into an expression of profound clinical amusement that bordered on open contempt. He set the marker down, leaned back in his chair, and looked at me as if I were an illiterate child attempting to explain the laws of thermodynamics to a university professor. He reminded me that my position as a low-level administrative clerk in the county archives did not qualify me to question his 35 years of independent financial consulting experience. He stated that his documentation was flawless, his contract was ironclad, and my attempt to invent imaginary title defects was nothing more than a pathetic, transparent effort to prolong my subsidized dependency on his estate. Your understanding of property law is as deficient as your contribution to this household, Vivian, he said, his voice flat and cutting as he reclaimed his marker. You have exactly 8 days left to remove your person and your meager effects from my property, and I suggest you spend that time searching for a room you can actually afford, rather than wasting your breath on legal theories you lack the intelligence to comprehend. This conversation is officially concluded, and any further attempts to interfere with my portfolio management will result in an immediate suit for civil harassment and the forfeiture of your security deposit. I stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, watching him return to his labeling, his hand steady and arrogant as he wrote the number 24 on a box of financial ledgers. I felt no anger, no urge to argue, and no desire to convince him of the danger that was currently hovering over his head. His dismissal was absolute, rooted in a lifetime of believing that his daughter was a minor mathematical error that could be easily erased from his books. I took my hand out of my pocket, leaving the iron plumb bob behind, turned on my heel, and walked out of the room without uttering another word. I had met the ethical obligation required of me by offering the warning, and he had chosen to treat it as a deficit. I walked up the stairs to my room, picked up my phone, and sent a 2-word text message to Thomas, let it run. The morning of November 10th arrived with a sharp, blinding sunlight that bounced off the glass and steel facades of the downtown financial district, casting long, geometric shadows across the marble pavements of the 4th Street Commercial Center. At precisely 10:45 a.m., I walked into the grand public atrium of the Sovereign Title Insurance Complex, a soaring 4-story structure defined by polished granite pillars, indoor palm trees, and the constant low-frequency rush of a multi-tiered decorative waterfall. The closing for the sale of 42012 Elm Street was scheduled for 11 o'clock in the Executive Settlement Suite on the glass mezzanine, a highly visible conference area enclosed by transparent acoustic glass that overlooked the entire public concourse below. As I ascended the curved escalator, my leather briefcase held securely at my side, I could see Arthur already seated through the glass walls, his silhouette rigid and triumphant against the bright backdrop of the city skyline. He had arrived 20 minutes early to establish his dominance over the physical environment, treating the corporate conference room as though it were his private throne room. He was dressed in his most expensive charcoal wool suit, his silver hair combed back with military precision, his leather portfolio unfolded before him on the polished white quartz conference table. Seated across from him was Mr. Charles Sterling, the lead acquisitions attorney for Vanguard Residential Partners, a younger man in a tailored navy blazer who was adjusting a gold fountain pen, and Ms. Lydia Miller, the senior escrow officer, who was systematically sorting a thick stack of legal instruments into organized columns. Arthur was speaking in a loud, resonant voice that easily carried through the open doorway of the suite, his tone dripping with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed he was about to touch the apex of his financial career. I stepped through the glass doorway into the suite at exactly 10:55 a.m., my movements silent, my expression entirely neutral as I stood near the perimeter of the room. Arthur did not interrupt his conversation with Mr. Sterling, merely casting a brief, dismissive glance in my direction before pointing to a single vinyl chair located near the coat rack in the back corner. He was in the middle of explaining to the corporate attorney how he had successfully managed the extraction of the residential occupants without incurring any unnecessary litigation or relocation expenditures, presenting his strategy as a masterclass in asset optimization. He spoke loudly enough for the administrative assistants outside to hear, deliberately ensuring that his victory over his own household was entered into the public record of the room before a single document was signed. The escrow officer, Ms. Miller, tapped her gold wristwatch and indicated that all parties were present, and that the formal execution of the transfer could now commence. She slid the primary document across the court's table toward Arthur. The affidavit of sola title and warranty of value, a critical legal instrument in which the seller swears under oath that no outstanding encumbrances, historical restrictions, or competing ancestral claims exist on the property. Arthur picked up his heavy black fountain pen, signed his name with a grand, looping flourish on the principal signature line, and looked up at me with a cold, mocking smile that was designed to finalize my humiliation in front of the corporate executives. Did you come to witness the conclusion of your dependency, Vivian, or did you simply want to see what a genuine commercial transaction looks like before you pack your remaining boxes? Arthur spoke the words with an elevated theatrical cadence, his voice echoing off the glass panels of the mezzanine so that several pedestrian clients in the atrium below looked up to see the source of the commotion. He slid the signed affidavit back to Ms. Miller, leaning back in his leather chair with his arms crossed over his chest, his pale gray eyes daring me to make a scene or utter a single word of emotional protest that he could use to justify his long-term characterization of me. I walked forward to the edge of the court's table, my hands steady as I opened the brass clasps of my briefcase, pulling out a thick document enclosed in a certified blue legal jacket that bore the wet, raised seal of the county district court. I did not raise my voice, I did not look at Arthur's face, and I did not address his insult. I placed the document directly over his signed warranty affidavit, pressing it down onto the stone surface with my index finger so that Mr. Sterling and Ms. Miller could clearly read the bold, stamped caption on the first page, "Emergency injunction for title defect and immediate notice of lease pendens, entered November 10th at 9:15 a.m." The white court's table became an arena of absolute stillness as the escrow officer and the corporate attorney leaned forward simultaneously, their professional eyes locking onto the court seal and the specific parcel numbers listed in the petition. I stood perfectly straight, my left hand resting quietly in my coat pocket around the heavy iron plumb bob, feeling its solid, unyielding center grounding me against the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. "This transaction is formally frozen by order of the state court," I said, speaking in a low, measured cadence that was completely level, entirely clinical, and entirely absolute. The underlying root deed of 1961 contains a non-extinguished reversionary covenant that renders this warranty deed a material misrepresentation under Property Code Section 84. 50% of the equitable title to Block 412, Lot 8 belongs to my mother's surviving heirs, and a formal claim for probate fraud has been entered against the 1998 estate filings, based on the active concealment of the misindexed historical writer. Arthur's face did not change color immediately. Instead, a tight, rigid mask of disbelief seemed to freeze his features as he stared at the blue-backed document blocking his contract. He let out a sharp, forced laugh that sounded completely hollow against the acoustic glass, rising to his feet so quickly that his leather chair rolled back and struck the glass wall with a loud, ringing thud. He began shouting that this was a fraudulent fabrication, a desperate, hysterical stunt, pulled by an unstable administrative clerk who was facing a lawful eviction and possessed zero understanding of institutional finance. He demanded that Ms. Miller ignore the paper and proceed with the wire transfer, his voice rising to a harsh, strained pitch that broke through the soundproofing and attracted the attention of the entire security detail on the first floor. If you are observing this unfolding of quiet accountability and believe that the loudest voice in the room rarely holds the strongest hand, Please ensure you are subscribed to the Calm Revenge episodes so you never miss an episode of Calculated Justice. The corporate attorney, Mr. Sterling, did not listen to Arthur's shouting. He had already pulled his gold reading glasses from his pocket and was reading through the certified title abstract attached to the injunction. As his eyes moved down to the 1961 rider and the specific statutory penalties for breach of warranty, the professional warmth completely vanished from his face, replaced by a cold corporate fury that was far more devastating than any physical outburst. He stood up, closed his fountain pen with a sharp metallic snap, and turned his back on Arthur, refusing to look at him as he addressed the escrow officer directly. Vanguard Residential Partners immediately withdraws its tender of performance and cancels this closing effective the second, Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping to a freezing analytical whisper that cut straight through Arthur's ongoing tirade. He turned his gaze to Arthur, his eyes narrowed into 2 points of hard legal calculation. You signed an explicit affidavit of sole warranty less than 2 minutes ago while knowing that a formal title injunction was being filed against your estate. Not only is this transaction void, but Vanguard will be filing an immediate civil suit before the end of the business day to seize your restricted trading account for the $75,000 earnest money deposit, plus $32,000 in accumulated development costs and treble damages for material fraud. Arthur's shouting ceased instantly, the air escaping his lungs in a faint whistling gasp as the full scope of the numbers hit his mind. The charcoal suit suddenly looked too large for his frame, his shoulders slumping as he looked from the corporate attorney to the escrow officer, who was already packing the unsigned deed copies back into her folder, effectively closing the ledger on his grandest ambition. His ally, the corporate firm he had praised for weeks as the ultimate validation of his intellect, had turned on him within 60 seconds of discovering that his documentation was a liability. He had tried to treat his daughter as a deficit that could be deleted from a spreadsheet, and instead the mechanical laws of the documentation he worshipped had ground his entire portfolio into a permanent, frozen loss. I closed my briefcase, secured the brass clasps with 2 distinct clicks, and looked at Arthur one final time as he sank back into his leather chair, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the quartz table. I did not smile, I did not offer a word of triumph, and I did not stay to watch him face the title insurance investigators who were already walking up the escalator toward the mezzanine suite. I turned away from the glass room, walked out onto the marble mezzanine, and began my descent toward the public atrium, focused entirely on the steady, vertical line of my own path forward. The legal proceedings moved through the county circuit court with a quiet, grinding efficiency that required exactly 6 months and 4 days to reach a final, unappealable resolution. There were no dramatic announcements or public declarations in the local forums, only the steady routine filing of stamp-dated documents into the permanent archives. The court formally validated the 1961 restriction, ruling that Arthur's attempted sale to Vanguard Residential Partners was an action that directly violated the foundational terms of the original deed. To satisfy the resulting civil liabilities and avoid a formal investigation into the 1998 probate filings, Arthur was forced to enter into a comprehensive settlement agreement with the development firm. He liquidated his primary high-yield brokerage account to pay Vanguard exactly $96,400 in accumulated damages, architectural fees, and legal expenses, completely exhausting the financial reserve he had spent 35 years prioritizing over his family. The Craftsman House on Elm Street was completely removed from the commercial market, its structural integrity preserved from the demolition crews that had been scheduled to dismantle it. The court ordered a partition of the property, recognizing me as the sole legal heir to my mother's 50% share of the estate. Because Arthur's remaining liquid assets were entirely consumed by the Vanguard judgment, his remaining 50% equity in the house was placed into a court-ordered receivership. I secured a modest, 20-year fixed-rate mortgage from the county credit union and purchased his frozen share from the court trustee for $62,000, an amount that represented the exact assessed valuation of the land, minus the structural depreciation. Arthur vacated the premises on a cold Thursday morning in early April, moving his 45 numbered cardboard boxes into a small rented studio apartment near the industrial rail yards on the western edge of the city, where the monthly rent is tracked by an automated corporate leasing system. On the day the final unencumbered deed was recorded under my name alone, Thomas came to the house on Elm Street, carrying a small paper bag containing 2 pastries from the bakery down the street. We sat at the oak dining table, the same table where Arthur had once totaled the cost of my milk and school books, and we ate in a comfortable, unhurried silence that did not require the validation of a spreadsheet. I looked across the room at Thomas, whose ancient hands were steady as he brushed a few stray crumbs from the wood surface, and I thanked him for his 6 months of meticulous research and for his absolute faith in the permanence of the public record. He merely nodded, his pale eyes reflecting the soft afternoon light, reminding me that the law, when approached with patience and clinical precision, eventually corrects the errors of those who believe they are completely beyond its reach. The old iron plumb bob no longer resides in the dark, dust-scented gap beneath the loose floorboard in my bedroom closet. I cleaned the decades of tarnish from its surface with a soft cloth and a drop of mineral oil, revealing the dark, solid grain of the iron that my grandfather had cast so long ago. It now hangs from its thick, knotted cotton cord in the center of the large bay window in the living room, catching the pale morning light as it separates the sky from the earth. It is no longer a hidden weapon or a secret symbol of survival. It has transformed into a quiet piece of the household architecture, an open declaration of stability and alignment that welcomes anyone who crosses the threshold. The small stone weights that Arthur had used to pin down his eviction notices have been returned to the gravel driveway, where they belong, allowing the wind to pass freely across the open pages of the house. True stability is never achieved by rendering the people around you into liabilities or calculating the profit margins of your own blood. It belongs exclusively to those who understand that the world operates on an immutable gravity that eventually restores balance to the most distorted lives. The quiet foundations we preserve with patience will always outlast the grand structures built on the exclusion of others. I sit by the stove in the kitchen, watching a copper kettle reach a steady boil while the scent of fresh pine oil rises from the clean hardwood floor. The house is perfectly level now.